Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for being here at this episode of the MirYam Institute webinar. You may have noticed we took a brief respite from our webinars and from our podcasts over the Chagim, or the Jewish high holy days, broadly described as the month of September. But we're back now, and we're very, very pleased to be with you. And on behalf of myself and on behalf of Rosita Perini, co-founder of the MirYam Institute, I thank each and every one of you for listening to us, whether you are listening by way of the live cast or a postcast or watching us on JBS TV or on a podcast. Thank you so very much for being with us. And it's a nice opportunity for me to say that I hope all of you had a wonderful series of Chagim with you and yours. Hopefully it was a much more joyful and shared experience than was 2020. I know that it was for me, and I hope that that's very much the case for each and every one of you who's listening today. I also want to express my profound thanks to Rosita Panini. Rosita, thank you so much for everything that you do for the organization day in, day out. None of this would be possible without you. And of course, Rosita and I in common want to thank our great colleague, Alan Langer. Thank you, Alan, for all that you do in order to bring about everything that transpires here at the MirYam Institute. Also, ladies and gentlemen, before I get to introducing our interviewees today, I wanted to announce that there's wonderful news. The MirYam Institute is very pleased to have officially founded and opened a graduate center at Emory University. Emory University is one of the top 20 ranked universities anywhere in the United States of America. It's a fine seat of academia, and we are delighted, honored, humbled, and excited to have founded and opened the MirYam Institute Center for International Ethics and Leadership. It's a graduate center at Emory University, and it is found in the Faculty of Law. We're extremely proud of this initiative. We believe that this is going to help us to educate and to inform a rising generation of American leaders, and to promote Israel's viewpoint on any number of topics of international concern and intrigue. So please look for that. It's been announced in the press. We'll also be making a press release very, very shortly. And on behalf of Rosita and myself and everybody who has helped us to come to this stage, I want to convey our very best wishes to Rabbi Dr. Ira Broid. Rabbi Dr. Ira Broid is an ethicist who is heading up the MirYam Institute Center for International Ethics and Leadership. And we wish him to go from strength to strength, and by way of that, to strengthen all of us in turn. So that's the MirYam Institute Center for Ethics and Leadership at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, is now a go. So we will be sending more and more information about that. Now, without any further ado, we're on for about 75 minutes today. So that's an hour and 15 minutes approximately. And we've got a big topic to talk about. And that topic, of course, is Israel's geostrategic positioning. I actually somewhat regret bringing this about with two speakers, not because I think anything poorly about either of the speakers, but I know that each one of them is more than capable of filling that 75 minutes on their own. And also because it's such an enormous topic, I wonder whether I ought to have divided it across several webinars, but we'll find out. I've got 8 questions for you, and I'd like to encourage the two of you to give short, sharp, clear answers, and feel free to come back on one another if you disagree or want to supplement that which the other has said. So by way of an introduction, firstly, we are delighted to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Yochai Guiski, who is a 23-year veteran of the Israel Defense Forces. He retired in 2020 as Lieutenant Colonel after serving in the Israeli military intelligence. Yochai served in various roles, including coordination of government activities in the territories, strategic planning division, and the Ministry of Defense. He is an expert in international affairs, the Middle East, and national security, with hands-on experience in devising and executing strategic planning at the highest levels of Israeli decision-making. After his retirement from the Israel Defense Forces, he has published several articles relating to US-Israel and US-Russian relations. Yochai holds a master's degree in international relations with a focus on security studies from Tel Aviv University and a bachelor's degree in economics and management from Tel Aviv University. He's also a fierce critic of mine on the MirYam Institute as an expert commentator. He regularly lets me know that he disagrees profoundly with my opinions. And that's what we love about the MirYam Institute. And I encourage you all of you to read Yochai's papers. Go to our commentary section, look at his papers, one of which I'll be asking him about, particularly with regard to China and Iran's nuclear ambitions during the course of this conversation. But also do be sure to read his paper entitled Critiquing Benjamin Antony. He was not backward in coming forward with his critique, and I know that it raises the level of conversation. So Yochai, thank you so very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I also want to introduce his co-panelist, Yaakov Lappin. Yaakov Lappin is an Israel-based military affairs correspondent and analyst. He provides insight and analysis for a number of media outlets, including Jane's Defense Weekly, a leading global military affairs magazine, and JNS.org, which is a news agency with wide distribution among Jewish communities in the United States. In the past, Yaakov worked as the defense correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. He is also a research associate at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar Ilan University, and a frequent guest commentator on international television news networks, including Sky News and I-24. He is the author of Virtual Caliphate, Exposing the Islamist State on the Internet. And Yaakov holds a BA in Politics and Modern History from the University of Manchester and an MA in the History of International Relations from the London School of Economics. Yaakov, thank you so very much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
And I'll also say that Yaakov and I, you heard in his bio that Yaakov studied at the University of Manchester. That's where our friendship was forged. I'm proud to call Yaakov among my closest friends, somebody that I go to talk about any number of issues, discuss them, hear his opinions. And I think we reach consensus more than disagreement most of the time, but not all of the time. So just let me check. Alan Langer is texting me. I just want to make sure there's nothing wrong with my sound. Okay, great. So everything's good. And he's texting me that it's Ira Bedzau. I just want to make sure I didn't make a mistake. Ira Bedzau, Professor Dr. Rabbi Ira Bedzau is going to be the head of the MirYam Institute Center for Ethics and Leadership at Emory University. And we wish Ira every possible success. Thank you, Alan, for that correction. So let's dive right in to our questions today. And Yochai, Yaakov, as I've said, it's wonderful to have you both with us. I want to ask a very simple question for the benefit of our listeners and our viewers. And I'd like each of you, Yaakov first, Yochai thereafter, to please define for us very, very clearly what it is that you mean when you use the term Israel's geostrategic positioning. So Yaakov, let's have a tight definition from you, and then Yochai, the same from you.
Okay, so if we break down the term geostrategic, we're talking about geography and the way that it's applied in terms of its influence on the geography of a country. And it's this combination of a country's geographical conditions and the way they influence that country's ability to implement its foreign policy, whether that's military or political or diplomatic. That sum total, that wide picture, is how I would define a geostrategy.
And Yochai, what's your take on that term?
Well, I take it from strategic studies. You talk about the realist approach to international affairs. So it is the power that Israel holds in order to influence what happens to it and where it is in relation to other countries. So its geostrategic positioning means how does it relate to other countries in terms of power, which means that economic, it takes strategic influence, technology, and militarily, deterrence, all these components of power according to the realist view of international relations.
Wonderful. So I can see we're going to get two very different insights on the same topic, and that's what we like to have here. I would like to proceed in the following manner, which is that I'd like to begin with those states and non-states that share a border with the state of Israel, and then gradually pull back the lens from there. So with that having been said, let's begin with the Gaza Strip. I would like you, please, to assess Israel's position vis-a-vis the Gaza Strip. We had a further round of conflict in May of this year. It never feels as though the next round of conflict is too far away in the distance. Israel was targeted by close to 4,500 rockets during that campaign. I'm referring to Operation Guardian of the Walls. So my questions are, number one, what will yield continuing calm, and what will result in a flare-up of hostilities with regard to the Gaza Strip? And the second question is that there is an ongoing debate as to whether or not Gaza represents a strategic threat to the state of Israel. What is your view on that question? Is it or is it not a strategic threat? And Yochai, I'm going to come to you first of all. You can answer those questions in whichever order you like.
Is it a strategic threat? Most definitely. When you have something of a military threat that is so close to your hinterland, to your strategic assets, that can influence at any time, at any place, your politics, your economics, the ability of the military to act. It can be a second front if something happens, God forbid, in Lebanon or Iran or something else. So it is most definitely a strategic threat to Israel. And it is, if I may relate to the first question, it is unstable. It is inherently unstable. So Israel is trying to what can I say, calm the situation down, a situation which is inherently turbulent. You have a population, a large population, in a status of constant humanitarian strife under the control of a Taliban-like entity, which controls every facet of their lives. And then it has to try and help that population, provide them with electricity, water, provide them with the humanitarian needs that pass through Israel into Gaza, while dealing with terror attacks from that territory by Hamas, by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and by other terror groups, some of them affiliated with ISIS, some of them affiliated with Iran. So it's inherently unstable. So Israel is trying to use a whole of government approach, trying to use economic carrots and sticks, trying to use international aid to come into that area, trying to convince Hamas to make short-term or long-term deals on stabilizing the situation, and trying to avert another military crisis there that could happen at any moment, at any time. Unfortunately, because of that inherent instability. It can be caused by Iran, it can be caused by something in the Palestinian arena, it can be caused by a miscalculation when Hamas or someone else tries to do something and doesn't understand what it means to Israel, or it can be a mistake, a missile hitting a kindergarten and you're at war.
So Yaakov, I'm actually surprised by Yochai's response, not because Yochai's changed his position. I think it's the first time I've asked him whether he views Gaza as a strategic threat, but I know that it's oftentimes been the case that people have said that Gaza is categorically not a strategic threat. I've long thought that Gaza is a strategic threat. I've thought that for years. I've spoken to you about it. What do you think has happened to shift the mind from looking at Gaza as a tactical challenge that needed to be managed to now hearing more and more voices such as those of Yochai saying it is a strategic threat? That's my first question. And then going off what Yochai said about needing to keep the situation calm, but always readying yourself for a response that can escalate things. Tell us about some of the regional players, the Qataris, for example, come to mind, that Israel works with, collaborates with in order to keep things simmering, but perhaps not boiling over in the Gaza Strip. And how tenable are those connections?
So I think Yochai really put his finger on it, the ability of the Gaza Strip to influence immediately the routine situation of the state of Israel, to place central Israel and its millions of citizens in the economic hub in a standstill situation because of its arsenal of rockets, means that Gaza is by definition a strategic threat. And any territory that can do that is by definition a strategic issue and not a tactical one, not one that only affects a small part of the country. I think that when it comes to Gaza, one of the problems that we have here in Israel is definitions. What is Gaza? What is Hamas? We haven't really actually made up our minds about how we define that. And I would propose that Gaza and Hamas, we can call it Hamastan, is in many, many ways, it's a de facto state. It answers so many of the parameters that a state has. It has its own government, it has its own armed forces, which are also terrorists because they're hybrid, they're part military in terms of their hierarchy, they're part guerrilla, and they're part terrorist in terms of their dedication to harming and killing Israeli civilians. So we have this hybrid military force. We have an independent political Islamist government. This is a Muslim Brotherhood sovereignty project. That is how I view the Gaza Strip. It's really an experiment by the Muslim Brotherhood to see if they can set up and maintain a state. And because Hamas itself pursues these multiple objectives, on the one hand, setting up a sovereign state, but on the other hand, committed to its ideology of unending conflict with Israel. And ultimately, we have to, I think it always has to be said when we're talking about Hamas, Hamas's long-term objective is to destroy the state of Israel and replace it with an Islamic state. So strategically, that is where it's committed to, but tactically, it is willing to enter long periods of ceasefires so long as it can exploit those truces to its ends. So what we're stuck with is a constant balancing act by both sides. Hamas is looking to give its people some time to recover from rounds of war, but it insists that it's able to continue building up its force, these rockets that turn it into a strategic threat. And Israel also is pursuing these sort of two wants, right? On the one hand, it's a desire to maintain long periods of calm and routine. It's good for the economy, it's good for society. But on the other hand, interfering with Hamas's force buildup process and not letting it build this huge arsenal of rockets, which Israel did unfortunately do. And this May conflict that we just experienced recently was a demonstration that Israel did not get this balance right. So I think, I'll stop there to let the conversation continue, but I think, we have to get clear on definitions and what we're looking at when we're talking about Hamas on the Gaza Strip.
But I do want you to come back, Yaakov, just a little bit with some of the regional players that have been worked with, collaborated with, coordinated with by Israel, reluctantly in most cases, in order to keep things simmering but not boiling over. Just give us a 2-3 sentence overview of that. Okay,
so there is a sort of coalition that's acting for stability in this region, each for their own interests. And the main party here is Egypt. Egypt is the one that's mediating these attempts to form a long-term arrangement that will stabilize the Gaza Strip. Egypt is deeply concerned by the conflict that could spill over from Gaza to the Sinai, where it's dealing with a jihadist insurgency. It wants Gaza stable and quiet. And as a result, it also wants to display its centrality as a central Arab actor, both to the region and to the Biden administration, which has taken a very critical role of the El-Sisi administration. So it has multiple reasons to try and show that it can really influence the Gaza Strip. And I think that recently it's demonstrated that it can influence the Gaza Strip because it has used its crossing with Gaza, the Rafah border crossing, to inject into Gaza some of the things that Hamas is demanding that come in: reconstruction material, road construction material, infrastructure. Some of these things are core Hamas demands. So that has helped stabilize Gaza. And I think what's interesting here is that Egypt is increasingly acting as a sort of bypass mechanism when Israel and Hamas get stuck, because Israel has its own demands of Hamas to release the remains of 2 soldiers who were killed in action and 2 civilians who are being held by Hamas. And until that happens, it's not going to open up Gaza fully as much as it can. So Egypt is stepping in here as a sort of bypass mechanism, and that's helping to stabilize the situation. And Qatar, for its own interests, is acting really as the cash machine here. Qatar is funding many of the core civilian needs of the Gaza Strip. And currently it's in talks with Hamas about how it can fund its government officials, approximately 30,000 government officials. So what we're seeing is a coalition of actors coming together to answer Hamas's core needs. And Israel is cooperating with this in order to promote its own interest in stability. And Qatar and Egypt are the two main players. There are others, but those are the two main players that I would point out here.
Thank you very much, Yaakov.
So I would add, another major one, the Palestinian Authority, which has been unfortunately trying to destabilize the Gaza Strip over the last few years, cutting off money to the Strip, cutting off the money for government employees, and increasing the pressure on Hamas, and by that destabilizing the Gaza Strip.
So let's move northward now. And I said I'm going to try and get all of this done swiftly, but your answers are certainly helping all of us to understand the region already. I want to move directly to Lebanon. I mentioned in the previous question that during Operation Guardian of the Walls, Israel was the target of close to 4,500 rockets. I mentioned that number again because it provides context for just how foreboding the situation in southern Lebanon is for the state of Israel. The current commander of the Home Front Command, General Ori Gordon, recently came out with a statement that said the following. He said that during Operation Guardian of the Walls, quote, cities like Tel Aviv and Ashdod experienced the highest number of fire toward them in the history of the state of Israel. We saw a pace of more than 400 rockets fired toward Israel on a daily basis. And then he went on to say that in a future conflict or a war with Hezbollah, we, Israel, expect more than 5 times the number of rockets fired every day from Lebanon to Israel. Basically, he said, we are looking at between 1,500 and 2,500 rockets being fired daily toward the state of Israel from southern Lebanon. Now, Yochai, there is massive instability in that country, in addition to the threats that I just delineated. Tell us about the source of that instability, and tell us also how prepared Israel is for the prospect of facing up to 2,000 rockets per day being fired at our citizens.
The instability in Lebanon is a long-term project. Some of it is basically the fact that Hezbollah is a major player there. It makes politics in Lebanon untenable. It always has veto power if it uses its political or its military might in order to prevent any action that might in any way prevent it from using its influence in Lebanon or getting its funds through. We can all remember what happened in 2007, if I'm not remember, when they closed down Beirut because someone was trying to replace the officer that was in charge of the Beirut airport. And he was the one that was looking the other way when Hezbollah was getting its money or anything else through the Beirut airport. So this has been a long simmering problem that has destabilized and made Lebanon, I would say, a failed state at every turn. And what has exacerbated it are 3 things. One, the explosion in the Beirut port, which has instantly vaporized an entryway and a major economic way and port to the Lebanon system. So it immediately increased the cost to every Lebanese because now they had to reroute how supplies and how trade is done with the state. The second thing is the increased pressure by the United States on the financial system in Lebanon and in Syria. Those two are connected. Syria has been using Lebanon to funnel money to the Syrian regime. And as the pressure cranked up on Syria because of the Caesar Act, the pressure cranked up on Lebanon as well. And the third thing is that Hezbollah itself became far more active and involved in what happened in Syria, and that in itself, and with the war with ISIS, and that in itself created more tensions within the state. Its involvement, in the war in Syria, which is very unpopular with some Lebanese, and the fact that ISIS came back and attacked Lebanese citizens because of it. All three are a part of how unstable the state is, and how prepared Israel. I would say that Israel is as prepared as it can be to such an eventuality. You can always be more prepared. We have Iron Dome. We could use more Iron Dome systems. We can use more interceptors. But I believe that the IDF can do what needs to be done, which is to rain havoc on Lebanon and try and suppress that fire. Will it bring calm and make everything okay? No, but the Lebanese and everyone else that is employing Hezbollah against Israel would learn their lessons.
Yaakov, I'm going to shift to Syria, but before I do, and I'm going to pose the Syrian question to you, do you have anything to add there to what Yochai just said with regard to Lebanon?
Sure. Just quickly, I think that because Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy, and this comes back to the question of geostrategy, because Iran is in Lebanon and Iran is in Syria, and it's also influencing the Gaza Strip, and it's no longer possible in the year of 2021 to separate these first, second, and third circles, because Iran and this axis is playing a multi-regional game here. We have to also look at what Hezbollah's role is according to the Iranian game plan. And my understanding is that Hezbollah's primary role today is to deter Israel from attacking Iran's nuclear program. That is its first mission. And there are, of course, other missions that it has. It could be brought into play in all sorts of other escalations, but I think that that's the primary mission that the Iranians have set for it. And as a result, they're not going to try and activate Hezbollah so quickly. I agree that any sort of match can light the fire. That's the situation that we're in. But I think that really it's not possible to separate that role that Iran has given to Hezbollah from the question of Iran's nuclear program and Israel's options. So I'm just throwing that into the mix.
Thank you. So on to Syria. Yaakov, you and I have spoken about this. Yochai, I haven't yet spoken to you about this at length, but I think you probably know my opinions from the article with which you disagreed that I penned. I have a deep sense of frustration about what I perceive to be extreme hesitancy on the part of the Israeli government and the defense establishment to proactively seek out and destroy capabilities of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. But one area wherein that charge of hesitancy cannot really be leveled is in Syria. Israel is determined to control and degrade the capabilities sent by Iran into Syria and potentially onward to Hezbollah. We're acting to interdict weapons systems and capabilities on a very, very frequent basis. And so, Yaakov, I'd like you to tell us, please, specifically what it is that Israel is continuing to disrupt in Syria and how effective our efforts are being shown to be. And also, if I may ask you, how long do you think that policy can continue to be effective there? Isn't the clock going to run out eventually?
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you asked that question, I think very correctly, in relation to Lebanon, because I think one of the things that really jolted Israel into starting to take this kind of proactive action, which it calls the campaign between the wars, which really got going in 2013, approximately 2 years after the Iranians got involved in Syria and started entrenching themselves there, was the understanding that between 2006, between the end of the Second Lebanon wartime and 2011 approximately, Israel missed an opportunity to stop Hezbollah's force buildup. And it was that realization that we can't make this mistake again in Syria. We can't let a Hezbollah 2.0 or worse set up shop in Syria that I think really jolted the defense establishment and the government into that willingness. And I think it's an excellent policy in Syria. It's a proactive policy. It's very responsive to what the Iranians have been trying to do. So you can divide it into phases, say between 2011 and approximately 2013 and approximately 2015, 2016. During that phase, my understanding is that the Iranians had very ambitious programs for Syria. And I'm talking about deploying their own military forces. I'm not even talking about proxies. I'm talking about naval bases, air force bases, ground forces. They wanted all of that in Syria. And when Israeli reported strikes started coming in, they realized, and this is a strategic change on their part, that plan is simply not going to be allowed to happen. And they shifted gear and they decided to try and be more covert, the Iranians, and build a second Hezbollah. And this is really about arming their thousands of Shiite militia members who are in Syria. These are divisions that are coming in from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, a little bit also from Iraq, and arming them with rockets. They wanted to arm them with thousands of rockets and threaten Israel with those and really establish a second Hezbollah. And when that happened, the Israeli defense establishment shifted its own campaign to disrupt that kind of action. In terms of how effective it is, it's hard, of course, to know without knowing the intelligence, but it appears, and I think it's safe to assess that the plan that the Quds Force commander Soleimani had for Syria has not been implemented successfully. They don't have a second Hezbollah in Syria. They do have capabilities, military capabilities that are disturbing in Syria, but not at the quantity and the level that the Iranians would have wanted to. And that means that the campaign has been at least partially successful. Is it a long-term solution? I don't think it is, because the long-term solution is for Iran to get out of Syria. And there are many ways we can talk about that if we have time, how that might happen. But for the time being, I don't see any other option but for Israel to continue to mow the lawn in Syria, as it were, and to strike those capabilities when it sees them, and not to allow either the Iranians to entrench themselves in Syria or to transit advanced capabilities via Syria into Lebanon. Both of those things are being stopped.
Thank you very much, Yaakov. Yochai, I'm going to move on to Iran. I'm actually not going to ask you to come back on anything that Yaakov said there, because of time considerations, and I'd also like to see if I can get some audience questions in during this conversation. So let's talk a little bit about Iran. So, because after all, as Yaakov expressed, it is in no small part Iran with whom we are doing battle in Syria, if I can put it like that. And a rather audacious attack was carried out on a military base inside Syria used by the US-led coalition that is charged with battling back against and countering ISIS over there. This attack took place a week after pro-Iranian forces vowed that a strong response would come as a result of a US-led attack alleged to have been launched from that base. The reports about this stated that a military outpost in southern Syria used by US troops and its allies was hit by a coordinated attack on Wednesday, a week after pro-Iranian militias vowed revenge for an alleged Israeli-American strike near Palmyra. A US official said that no American troops stationed at the base near Syria's borders with Iraq and Jordan were injured or killed, but several blasts were heard from the base. So, Yochai, is Iran ratcheting up that which it is prepared to do in the region? And does this attack indicate that preparedness to step up the direct nature in which it's prepared to counter have a conflict with, interface with, and attack US forces?
This is a very good question, and this is something that the Iranians rarely did before. They had attacked the base previously unsuccessfully. They did it regularly in Iraq, so they're unafraid of attacking American forces in the region. In multiple ways. The question is, what is Iran who is Iran trying to hit? Why is it doing it? And what's its end game? Is it trying to get the US out of Syria? And the question is, are they trying to influence the Biden administration when it is leaving Afghanistan rather unceremoniously? and it's committed to leaving Iraq, and they're trying to influence it to leave Syria as well. It's a good question, and whether they think that this is going to influence someone, whether it is going to do something that helps them on their way, or is it just another way to harass the Americans as part of the greater plan of attacking and cost increase to the American forces in the region and the allies of the anti-Iranian coalition. They have attacked ships in various places. They have launched drones at Saudi Arabia. They've attacked the UAE. So it could be a part of the larger campaign, and it could be something that is specific to the Americans. I don't know which one is it. But the Iranians are bolder at the moment, at the last year, at what they do, reacting or initiating against Israel, against the UAE, against Saudi Arabia, even though they are now having talks with Saudi Arabia in Iraq. So I don't know which one is it, but whatever it is, it shows that the Iranians are willing to act, are willing to shape the area through action. And this is something that Israel has been doing in Syria, shaping through action, while the Americans have been shaping through inaction, mostly, and by leaving areas. That is the situation right now. I think they're trying to make the Americans leave Tanef, but I don't know if that is something that they will succeed.
So Yaakov, I just want to give credit to you, as is often the case. You know, you saw that story and shoved it proverbially under my nose. You sent it to me over WhatsApp. So thank you very much for doing that and allowing us to enrich the conversation by way of it. I'm now going to come to you about your man, Lieutenant General, Chief of the General Staff, Aviv Kochavi. I know that you are something of a fan of Kochavi and his writings and his musings and his speeches and his role as the Chief of Staff. So this question is about hitting Iran's nuclear capabilities. Israel has approved a budget of 5 billion shekels, 1.5 billion US, to be used to prepare the military for a potential strike against Iran's nuclear program. The 5 billion shekel budget is made up of 3 billion shekels from the previous budget and an additional 2 billion from the next budget slated to be approved, let's hope, by the government in November. And here's the point. It includes funds for various types of aircraft, intelligence gathering drones, and unique armaments needed for such an attack, which would have to target heavily fortified underground sites, such as those that we associate with Iran's nuclear program. The report of this increased budget came days after the US Air Force announced that it had carried out a successful test of its new bunker buster, the GBU-72 Advanced 5K penetrator. That 5,000-pound bomb can be used as a tool to strike Iranian nuclear sites. And here, to come to General Kochavi, last month, he told Walla News in Israel that Israel has greatly accelerated preparations for action against Iran's nuclear program. He went on to say that a significant chunk of the boost to the defense budget was intended for the purpose of striking Iran. It's a very complicated job with much more intelligence, much more operational capabilities, much more armaments required. And we are working on all these things. That's what Kochavi had to say about it. So my question to you, Yaakov, and I'm sure you know what it is to strike or not to strike? Where are Israel's strategic alliances on this front? I personally think it's a very mixed message that we're getting on the international arena. If there is a strike, can you assess the involvement of the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular across any sector, whether it be kinetic, direct, intelligence sharing, landing, any of that stuff? I recently spoke, Yaakov, to Yaakov Perry, the former head of the Shin Bet, and he was definitively resigned to the idea that Iran would soon gain nuclear military capabilities. But I also spoke to Secretary Mike Pompeo during a recent event at which we hosted him, and he was adamant that Iran's nuclear ambitions can be countered, including militarily. What are your thoughts?
I think in terms of Kochavi's mentioning of the acceleration and being very public about it, that is happening because Iran is accelerating its nuclear program. When Iran accelerates its activities, and particularly we're talking about fissile material and uranium enrichment, and they are more advanced now in terms of the uranium enrichment than they've ever been, that creates automatically a parallel accelerated capability development in Israel for striking those targets, those sites. Now, there's a very big difference, of course, between force buildup and force activation. And obviously, Israel does not want to enter into this kind of confrontation if it can avoid it. So, in terms of what I can see happening on the ground and in terms of Israeli contacts with the United States, because really it's the United States as Israel's number one ally and number one superpower, and still the superpower that is absolutely the most active and influential in the region, even if they don't want to be and even if they're drawing down. Israel is doing everything it can to coordinate with the United States and to transmit its position to it, which is that a return to the JCPOA, the 2015 deal, is a bad idea. If we look at the Iranian progress that has been made in the past year and a half, it's almost pointless from the Israeli perspective to go back to that agreement. And Israel's first preference is to encourage the United States and the international community to reach a bigger, better, longer deal, which would push Iran back not by 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 years, but by dozens of years. Now, how possible is that? We don't know. We really just don't know. But that is Israel's first preferred option. Now, in terms of the military capabilities, that plays two roles, right? Right now, it influences the pressure that's on Iran. The more the Israeli military threat is credible, the more likely it is that the Supreme Leader Khamenei and the other decision makers in Iran will take that into account. Despite their bravado, I think they take those kinds of threats very seriously. And that can influence for the better attempts by the United States and the international community to get Iran back to the negotiation table. If those negotiations keep stalling and the Iranians keep enriching uranium, and I'm not talking about tomorrow or next week, but I'm talking about the next 6 to 12 months, if the status quo stays as it is, then it becomes an acute crisis situation, and Israel would have to consider activating that force. And in terms of your question of what would happen after a strike, first of all, I think nobody knows. Nobody knows. It's such a dynamic situation. There are multiple contingencies. Would we enter a state-on-state war situation, which we have not been in for a very long time with Iran? Highly likely that the Iranians will retaliate fiercely, at least with their own missile and drone strike capabilities. And then comes the question of how many of their proxies would they activate? And the really big question is, what would Hezbollah's role be in this retaliation? Will it automatically lead to a regional all-out war or not? And I think that the IDF is planning for multiple contingencies, the most severe of which is a multiple front war involving Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the entire Shiite axis, the Gaza Strip could be dragged into that kind of, this is the worst case scenario. So these are the things that are being planned and thought out with a lot of uncertainty. And in terms of your question of should or shouldn't it strike, I think when there's absolutely no time left, if waiting further means an Iranian nuclear breakout, in my opinion, allowing Iran to become a nuclear armed state is an intolerable scenario, and one that would be worse than regional war. And I would give two quick reasons for that. First of all, it would enable the Iranians to provide a nuclear shield, a nuclear umbrella for their various proxies. And if we think that they're being provocative and destabilizing now, how would Hezbollah and Hamas and the Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq behave when they have a nuclear shield over them? What would the escalation dynamic look like there? And second of all, I think the fact that the Sunni states who are deeply alarmed by the Iranian nuclear program, and I think all of the negotiations between the Saudis and the Iranians, they're an expression of Saudi uneasiness in terms of how America might not be able to back them up. But I don't think we should make any mistake here. Saudi Arabia views Iran as its number one threat, enemy, arch rival. It's just simply being pragmatic and trying to de-escalate with these talks. But I think once Iran becomes a threshold or a nuclear state, the Sunni states will follow suit. Saudi Arabia, other countries in the region, Egypt, and the Gulf countries, I think they will want their own nuclear weapons. And even if it takes them a long time, getting to a situation where the Middle East, the world's least stable region, is armed with nuclear weapons is simply an intolerable situation for a long-term future. And I'll just come to your last question: would the Sunnis take part in a strike in Iran? I don't think they would. I don't think they can be expected, or we should expect them to take an active offensive part. But I think they, behind the scenes, allowing jets to fly through airspace, intelligence sharing, that kind of support, I think is very reasonable to expect. But I wouldn't expect them to go to war with Israel against Iran.
So Yochai, in addition to adding anything you might like to add to Yaakov's response there, I want to move you on to the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Quite simply, the issue of Iran raises the dependability of the word of the United States of America from the Israeli perspective. And there are many who question the durability of that word following the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Several did so hysterically, in my opinion. Others did so in an understated fashion. But there was certainly a questioning of that. What do you think are the implications of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan for Israel and for the region in the context of a potential strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities?
Again, a very good question. The issue of the Afghanistan withdrawal has several facets. One, it means to the Iranians and to others that you can eventually win out against the United States. You can hold out, you can hit them, and they'll eventually give up. That is not a good message to someone that is acting like Iran is, building up proxies that hit Americans, that hit American allies, and try to, let's say, over time, get to victory, not get to a war situation. It shows that that kind of strategy can work, and it's not a good message because of that. But on the other hand, the United States has shown that when it wants something like getting out of Afghanistan, it does it, and it doesn't matter the consequences. So when the United States is saying now we will not let Iran acquire a nuclear weapon, you can say that the Americans do what is necessary or what they think that is in their interest, no matter what anyone else is thinking. I know this is clutching at straws right now, giving that interpretation of the situation. But Iran really has only one thing to consider, and it relates to your other question. When it looks at war with Israel, I don't think that Iran is particularly concerned about Israel or what the UAE or even Saudi Arabia can do to it. It's a huge country, a huge population. No one's going to conquer Iran or do something. The question is, will the United States get involved when something like that happens? And when the United States seems to be not so interested in getting into new wars in the Middle East, the Iranian may breathe a bit easily on that front. This is why when Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, went to meet President Biden, he told him that what Israel prefer is a strategy of death by 1,000 paper cuts. Let's harass Iran. Let's take it out a bit by bit, and not let it go forward and increase the costs of what it's doing. And by that, make Iran understand that even if it tries to get to a nuclear weapon, it might not be able to do so, not because of a huge strike by Israel or the United States, but because there are a lot of little things that we can do to deny it that capability, and whatever it does, we will frustrate it. I think that Israel has been very successful at that. The assassination of Fakhrizadeh, mysterious explosion at sites that are related to the nuclear program, has shown Iran that it is not as invulnerable as it might want to be. So that is the alternative route to making Iran. It is the MirYam against Iran, harassing it, taking out its capabilities, and having a big hammer at the end, which the IDF chief of staff was alluding to with an attack, but making sure that along the way, Iran would suffer a lot of setbacks if and when it tries to get to a nuclear capability along the way.
So, Yaakov, I'm just going to ask you to unmute yourself if you can, please. And just Yochai used the phrase MirYam. Can you just explain MirYam for our listeners, please, so that everybody knows in this world filled with acronyms, military acronyms? Tell us about MirYam, because you referenced it earlier in the conversation, of course.
Sure. It's the campaign between the wars, and it's really become Israel's go-to military tool for disrupting the force buildup of adversaries without crossing the threshold into war. This is the balance that we're talking about, and it's really an incredible project. I mean, when you step back and look at it, it relies on the most high-quality intelligence and large numbers of personnel who sit around day and night analyzing real-time intelligence and red flagging developments that are clearly a threat to Israeli security, and then bringing that up to the discussion of, do we act now? Do we map it out for strikes later? And this constant sort of deliberation and monitoring, and then taking selective kinetic action to disrupt this kind of activity. And I think that, other ways of calling it would be gray zone military activity, any kind of military activity that's not peace and not war. It's somewhere in the middle. But I think the scope of the MirYam, this campaign, and the influence it has had on the region is truly remarkable, and it has resulted in becoming the go-to tool for the Israeli defense establishment, and it enables Israel to maintain its routine on the one hand and disrupt a lot of the activities that it finds troubling on the other. So it's really become a flagship project.
Thank you. So I have just two last questions. The first question is actually, ladies and gentlemen, just remember, we started dealing with those entities that are on Israel's border, with whom Israel shares a border. Then we pulled back the lens, as I said we would, and we spoke about Afghanistan and Iran and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And then we've moved on a little bit to the United States of America and Iran. And now I want to talk about the power struggle that's afoot between the United States and China as it pertains to Israel and as it pertains to Iran. And Yochai, you wrote a paper for us that dealt with this very issue. And I would encourage everyone to read it on your page, on the commentary section of the MirYam Institute website. And it's to do with China now holding the key to whether or not Iran gains nuclear weapons capabilities. So tell us about why it is that you felt the Iranians may look to China as a reliable ally in this fight, and why China may actually rebuff the Iranians a little bit, not wishing to overplay its hand in the region, and what that means for Israel, because of course what China does, America watches very, very closely.
Well, shortly, I would say these few sentences.
Could I ask you to speak a bit louder, please, Yochai? I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sure, sure.
Right.
Well, when we look at the JCPOA, it came about because Iran needed to sell its oil because it needed to get out of sanctions. And the only way to do so was to get a deal with the US and Europe, because Europe was the one that would be investing in Iran and buying its oil. And the US would be the one that would lift the sanctions and allow Iran to export its oil. But what is happening right now is that when Iran looks around and sees who's going to buy my oil for the next 20 years and who's going to invest in the country for the next 20 years, it's not seeing Europeans, it's not seeing the Americans, it's seeing Chinese. It sees the Belt and Road Initiative. It sees the thirst for Iranian oil and Iranian gas that even now sustains Chinese attempts, and not just attempts, but action to subvert the American sanctions and buy Iranian crude vis-a-vis unscrupulous ways. So Iran, when it looks to the future, says, hey, my future is with China. And by the way, China is the great rival of the United States. That's a bonus. And when you look at Chinese way of governance, it's really one that really complements the one of Iran. And there won't be pressures on humanitarian issues, human rights, and other changes. So China looks really, really good when it looks from Tehran. But China, on the other hand, sees that most of its crude is coming from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and it's not a bit reluctant to go all in on Iran. There are a lot of other players, rich players in the region, which wants to make them come into its area of influence. So China's looking at it a bit differently than Iran, and I don't think it will be so thrilled to walk towards Iran, to run towards the Iranian arms. This makes China a very important player, because I think that the way that you can influence Iran is by making it understand that there will not be any future to its endeavors if it goes nuclear, and the one that holds its future is China. So make them understand.
So I just have one last question for the panelists, and then I'm going to try and get a couple of questions in from the audience. Audience, if you have questions, raise your hands now. I've already taken down those that have been submitted. I'm going to, as I say, just limit it to one or two questions if I can. But Yaakov, you know, we've started this conversation, and it's about the geostrategic positioning of the State of Israel. The reality is at the fulcrum of the positioning of the State of Israel in any sense, whether it be geostrategic, whether it be its relations with the diaspora, anything to do with it, the fulcrum of that, of course, is the State of Israel itself. And we're into a new government. We're into a post-Bibi Netanyahu era. Assess for us how the government is doing. How's the coalition holding? One of the questions that I have is whether or not you feel, and Yochai, I'm going to ask you to wade in on this as well, both of you briefly, if you would. One of the questions that I have is whether or not Prime Minister Bennett has the necessary gravitas, quite frankly, to represent Israel's interests abroad in the way that we saw Prime Minister Netanyahu do. Full disclosure, I'm one of the individuals who actually protest voted whenever I was on the ground at home in Israel. Protest voted against Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I did that since 2014, since Operation Protective Edge, an operation into which I was drafted, and two of my brothers were drafted as well. So I'm not asking this question as somebody who necessarily laments the departure of Benjamin Netanyahu, although I do credit him for his achievements while in situ, of course. But I don't think anybody can take away from him his ability to represent Israel on the international stage. does Prime Minister Bennett have the gravitas and the sophistication to fill those shoes? Does he want to fill those shoes? And also, does he have the requisite strength and mastery of the coalition, not only to represent Israel's interests abroad, but also to reconnect with the diaspora, something that he's affixed as a key initiative of his, and any other aspects of governance that have global implications, international implications that you might like to touch upon? What are your thoughts there, Yaakov, briefly, and then Yochai, I'd love to hear from you. And don't feel that you have to limit your responses exclusively to the Prime Minister. Obviously, feel free to broaden that to the Foreign Minister and anybody else that you like.
So one of the things I think is interesting to point out here is when we're talking about geostrategic links and strategic alliances, of course, the United States is number one here for Israel. And one of the good things here is that it doesn't matter who the prime minister or the president is. The defense establishments have a working relationship that goes deeper than the ups and downs, the diplomatic ups and downs between government. We saw that in past administrations, in past governments. And that's one of the answers to the question in terms of the strategic implications of the ability to represent Israel to the United States in a good way. I think the most important aspect of that relationship is between the defense establishments and the strategic relationship, and that is deeper than the current political situation in either country. And of course, it's influenced, but I think it's important to put that on the table, that it's really an anchor of the alliance, and it's independent in many ways of the political ups and downs. In terms of the political situation itself, I think that what Bennett really represents in this country, to those who are willing to give him a chance, to those who have welcomed the change, is the idea of some sort of unity and the ability to get around these major divisions, which many of them could really be, boiled down to Bibi yes or no. In the end, so many of these questions came down to Bibi yes or no, and the country was so split and paralyzed politically and unable to form a government after successive rounds of elections, that just the ability to form a functioning government that's apparently about to pass a budget, and which includes the left, the center, the right, an Arab party, all of these components, this represents an ability to at least govern. And we didn't have that for quite a while. So in that respect, I think many here see it as welcome. And there's another camp here which views the government as illegitimate. We can't ignore that. There's a camp in this country that views the current government as illegitimate. So the divisions haven't gone away, but we do have a functioning government. How well it's able to represent itself to allies, and particularly the United States, I think it's too early to make determinations. It's simply too early. Time will tell. But the good news from my perspective is that the defense alliance and the relationship between the militaries and the intelligence agencies is excellent and independent of many of the governments that are in power.
Yochai, what's your thought? Same issue, if you would.
I would add just one thing. I would think that because of I would say even the close connection between Prime Minister Netanyahu and former President Trump would have made Israel even more of a political inter-American political issue had Benjamin Netanyahu still been in power. If progressives blocked the Iron Dome defense financing to Israel now, and they got a bipartisan rejection of that attempt, if that would have been Benjamin Netanyahu on the other hand, and with the relations that he had with the Democrats, with Biden, with President Obama, I think that would have been the implications and the act from the American side would have been far greater. He holds, his connection with Donald Trump holds something to the American electorate, to American progressives, and it might have been influencing their decision-making, how to pressure Israel on issues, such as China, such as the Palestinians. And the fact that Bennett is new and he is not Bibi, I think provides him with some leeway on that issue.
So there's just a quick question I'm going to take from the audience, then I want to just bring everybody up to speed in terms of what we've got upcoming here. The question is, where can you place Russia in the context of Israel's geostrategic position? And that's a wide open question. I usually like to have questions that are a little bit more tightly focused than that, but just because of we're all slaves to the clock here, very briefly, Yochai, give us an assessment of Russia's role with regard to Israel. And you can also do that actually parlaying off the previous question. How is a Naftali Bennett going to get the measure of a Vladimir Putin? Throw that into the mix as well, if you would.
Israel and Russia have a good relationship thanks to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Please speak up a little bit, Yochai.
Israel and Russia have a rather good relationship, providing that Russia is the main sponsor of most of our enemies. And that is a great credit to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Russians have been willing to talk to Israel, listen to Israel, accept Israeli position on issues, even if they disagreed with it, and allow Israel to do the things that are necessary for its deterrence and for its national security. It has been a very good development, and Russia has been very pragmatic on that issue. I don't necessarily think that, as Yaakov said about the connection between the establishment, I think now there is a connection that has some time it has developed. And so even if Naftali Bennett is on the other side, I think that Russia understands Israel, understands its interest, and has its own interests. So I don't think right now it would be a tremendous change in the relations with Russia. And it shows, and I would say that with relation to China and what I said, Israel has to deal with those players, even if the Americans sees them as their major rival. Israel has to maintain good relations with Russia in order to have its national interests and national security served, as we can see in the northern front. Israel will have to maintain some sort of connection with China as well in order to have its interest in the region, as China's shadow is growing larger. And the United States and Israel will have to find a way to understand each other on why and how Israel is relating to those two great powers.
Thank you very much. Benjamin, if I may yes. Just say one thing, and sometimes all of us are so focused on the day-to-day that we sometimes take the remarkable for granted. But I still think it's remarkable that Russia has become Israel's neighbor. The fact that Russia is in Syria for a very long time is a remarkable strategic shift. The fact that the Russian Navy and Air Force is here, is going nowhere, it plans to remain here, and Israel has to take that into consideration. And everything that it does in Syria is a huge strategic development, and it's still being felt, I think, on a daily basis and still being navigated. So I'm just throwing that into the mix. Russia has become, in many ways, Israel's neighbor in the region, and that's not an ordinary event.
And just in the interest of rolling off that, Yaakov, it's quite remarkable when one thinks about the Yom Kippur War, which we commemorated, whereby the state of Israel was literally thought of as a mere proxy in the great power struggle between then the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And in the intervening years, the state of Israel looks eyeball to eyeball directly with Vladimir Putin to talk about its own destiny in its own name, and it can assign its own red lines, and Russia will understand that those red lines are not to be crossed. So that's another example of the absolutely unfathomable coming to pass. And and being suddenly worthy of appreciation and acknowledgement. So it shows you how Israel is rising and continues to rise in the region. Just a couple of things before we go, ladies and gentlemen, very, very important. First of all, I want all of you to be aware of what we've got coming. On Thursday, November 4th, Yaakov Lappin is going to be conducting a webinar with Ambassador Arthur Cole, former Deputy Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Major General Gershon HaKohen, one of the greatest military minds that the State of Israel has. And that is going to be a webinar on the legacy of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was tragically assassinated. The two of those guests, under Yaakov's guidance, will be assessing the legacy of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, from his military service to his diplomatic service, and of course to his service as Prime Minister of the State of Israel. That's Thursday, November 4th at 12 p.m. Eastern. On Thursday, December 2nd, we've got a fascinating interview that I'll be conducting, which is a rescheduled interview. It was on for earlier in the year, but we've brought it back, and it's entitled Avenging the Munich Olympics Massacre and My Life Beyond the Military. And that's with Major General Doron Almog. Doron Almog was part of the hit squads, for want of a better phrase, that Prime Minister Golda Meir dispatched following the massacre of Israel's Olympic athletes in Munich in 1972, I believe it was. But in addition to what he did, General Almog, Rosita Panini in Israel recently arranged for me, for her, and for friends of our organization, a tour of a facility that Doron Almog founded in the Negev, in service of his son, who was born with severe disabilities. And we took a tour there during my recent trip home. And it's just the most fascinating facility that he's built. It now services anybody in need in the State of Israel, and has gone from being a place that cares for to a place that proactively dispenses care, particularly in the area of post-traumatic stress, of severe disabilities, mental and physical. And it's really an incredible site. And Doron Almog, Major General Doron Almog, will be interviewing with me about that, as well as his role avenging the massacre of Israel's athletes during the Munich Olympics. Then after that, that is going to be taking place on Thursday, December the 2nd. On Thursday, December the 16th, I will be being interviewed by Yaakov Lappin about the work of the MirYam Institute and anything else that Yaakov might like to ask me. So if you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel for entertainment and amusement on that day, you can tune in for an interview of me. It's Thursday, December the 16th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And also, I wanted to let all of you know about an exciting speaker series that we have at the suggestion of Rosita Panini. I think a wise suggestion, which is that we start to get into other aspects at the MirYam Institute beyond and in addition to aspects of defense, security, policy, politics, and so forth. And so in that vein, we have a special speaker series with a storied Israeli archaeologist. They take place on Thursday, December the 23rd, Thursday, January 6th, and Thursday, January 20th, and they are on fascinating subjects. The first one is weapons and warfare in the biblical world. I'm very much looking forward to hearing about that one. After that, we'll be looking at the kingdoms of Israel and Judah during the biblical period. And thereafter, we will look at an archaeological view of ancient Jerusalem. So these are a series of new talks with new focus that we will be bringing to you from the MirYam Institute. And that's an initiative suggested by Rosita Panini. And I want to thank you, Rosita, for bringing that to our attention. There will be many more of those. And finally, for those of you who are watching, I'm just going to screen share so that you can all see that which I opened with, which is the MirYam Institute Center. It's here. You can see it live now on our screens. Emory, you can see this has the imprimatur of Emory University, Emory Law, the Emory Law News Center, the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, receives gift from the MirYam Institute for Ethics, Leadership, and Development. And I want to zone in on this gentleman here, Rabbi Dr. Ira Bedzau. Rabbi Dr. Bedzau is an ordained rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, and also a judge, a dayan. He earned his undergraduate degree at Princeton University. He earned his graduate degree at University of Chicago, and then earned his doctorate at Emory University. He's the former UNESCO chair of ethics or bioethics. is really a leading light in the area of ethics and ethical leadership. And he is the faculty member of the MirYam Institute now at Emory University. So look out for what we're doing there. We've got a conference taking place in March that we'd love you to come and attend. And with all of that having been said, I just want to thank each and every one of you for listening, whether you're listening live or in a postcast podcast or watching us on JBS. Thank you indeed. It's always a privilege to have you here, and we appreciate you coming back after the short break for the Chagim, for the festivities of New Year. And of course, I want to reiterate my thanks to you, Rosita Panini, to Alan Langer, thank you so very much, and to our interviewees and our panelists, both commentators at the MirYam Institute, Lieutenant Colonel Yochai Guiski. It was great to have you with us, and Yaakov Lappin as well, our in-house analyst. Thank you so very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.